Yeah. Okay. Folks, if you're at the back, can you hear me okay? Okay, nods and thumbs up, that's good. Okay, hello there, front conference. Thank you for having me here in Zurich. As the slide suggests, which I think you can see, my name is Chris, and I am one of the directors of the Green Web Foundation, a non-profit that exists to work towards an entirely fossil-free internet by 2030. I've spent the last 15 years working for a string of wacky environmental data themed startups, and I've spent the last 3 years running an online community, being a co-organizer of an online community called climateaction.tech, which, as the name also suggests, is a community for climate action amongst techies. I'll try my best to talk clearly and slowly in the time I do have with you, but if you miss anything I see, this deck should also be online at the link that you see here, with a full transcript of everything that I say. So in the limited time that I do have with you, I'm going to cover these 3 topics. We're going to spend a bit of time talking about climate emergencies, how we got here, and how to handle the mental toll that being in one can have. We'll talk about some of the levers we have as professionally mobile technologists. And finally, because I don't always get to speak to an audience this knowledgeable, I want to ask for your help refining a model I am developing to integrate an awareness of climate into our work. Are you sitting comfortably? Yes. Okay, off we go. So this is your first tweetable slide. I'm not sure if we still take photos of slides at conferences, because it's been ages since I've been to an actual conference. But the link you see here is to a thread on Twitter by Professor Kimberly Nicholas, an actual climate scientist who I really respect. If you follow the link, you'll see a thread explaining this mantra that you see on screen, point by point, with a boatload of references. I also finished her book today, which I really, really can recommend. Anyway, I'm sharing this as a TLDR, because previously, when I'd give talks about the state of climate, I'd usually spend a bunch of time trying to explain that climate is a problem and show a bunch of stats and numbers. But these days, you only need to turn on the news to see these climate impacts, like seeing the sea on fire, videos about towns being washed away in climate-related floods. These are spectacular, but they're not so useful for acting upon. So I hope you'll be okay with me sharing this mantra instead. It's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, but we can fix it. In addition, I found this model that she shared really helpful for how we internalize news about our changing climate as well. Has anyone here heard of the 5 stages of grief before? You know, denial, bargaining, acceptance, depression, this kind of stuff? Okay, this is a little bit like that. Engaging with the subjects of our changing climate can be emotionally exhausting. But knowing there's a process that people work through, and there are stages you might recognize yourself as being in or seeing others in, is useful. So we might start with ignorance around the subject. Now, there are various valid reasons this might be the case, because, not least historically, climate has been a subject that's been really, really poorly covered in the media. Next, when we've learned a little bit about these changes, we might find them uncomfortable and distressing to think about. A lot of us might resort to avoidance. We might avoid talking about it with others, especially at work or at family gatherings. Next, when we do learn more, it's easy to slip into a state, a pretty depressed state, like doom. Like, oh geez, we're done for. Why even change anything? Let's just make the most of the time we do have. Well, I can see how we get into this state. It's important to understand that this is also a form of denial and retreat. And broadly speaking, only certain groups, who are often white and in the global north, get to be all okay doomer about climate while not being that exposed to the climate crisis. I think there are so many people who are exposed to these impacts already and who are still managing to keep doing their best to help each other. And I think that's a better example to look to. And we can look to them helping each other if we, to kind of get ourselves out of this phase. And with help and support from others, you might get through to this next stage, which Kimberly refers to as all of the feels. It's like, how do I talk to children about this? What kind of changes do I need to face the scale of the challenges ahead of me? There's so much to question. What kind of society dare I hope for now? Does what I'm learning about climate mean I'm a bad person? This is pretty overwhelming, and we're not really taught how to navigate this kind of uncertainty. I think it takes a lot of bravery to face it all. And it's important to realize that as you go through this whole process, you don't need to be perfect but to start acting or even engaging with the subject, but you do need to be brave. This, all the feel step, eventually gives way to purpose. You learn to harness the emotions you have, see the need for action, and eventually decide to sound the alarm and do something. When you get here, you'll find that you're in good company. Hundreds of governments, cities, and companies are now sounding the alarm and declaring climate emergencies, starting to act. You're not alone. But it's important to know that one of the reasons we're in an emergency that we often forget is that we're here because we keep burning fossil fuels instead of finding a way off of them. This isn't an accident. What's a tech conference without an XKCD slide, right? Okay, this was released recently, and it's helpful for understanding this not an accident point that I'm getting at. Some groups have known all about climate change for absolutely ages, longer than many of us in this room have been alive. Check the date to the left of this chart, and then you'll check the prediction on the top right. So this has been going as long as I've been alive. I was born in 1982. Now, some groups have decided that it's better for business to delay action on climate and sow doubt and uncertainty over these decades instead. There were solar panels on the White House in 1979 before they were taken off in the 1980s, for example. There's all these different paths we could have taken. And roughly, this is also when the idea of corporate self-interest as a guiding principle for, say, the country also took hold, you could argue. Now, this hasn't really stopped in the 80s. It's gone all the way through. Now, earlier this year, Greenpeace did a really interesting thing. They caught out a senior employee at ExxonMobil oil company, posing as a group looking to hire him as a lobbyist. They basically ended up with an hour-long speed confession in high definition on a recorded Zoom call where he explained all the tactics they use in a job interview and what impact they've had. He even ended up talking about on camera what he's doing right now in 2021 to sabotage the political process and slow down climate action, even this late in the day. Now, okay, quiz time. I won't try playing this video because playing videos in conferences is not very clever. But what do you reckon the answer is to this rhetorical question that you asked here, right? Did they aggressively fight against some of the science on climate? All right? Now, there's a term for this. And there's a useful term for this kind of activity. And a bit like how when we have the word dark patterns, that became a useful term in UX circles to talk about the kind of bad UX practices that work against the interests of our users. Predatory delay is a term to describe something like this behavior. It's the blocking or slowing of needed change in order to make money off unsustainable and unjust systems in the meantime. And this is what it looks like. This is what the impacts of it are. So predatory delay is what does this to climate action. Earlier this year, the US government was going to pass a historic infrastructure bill. It was going to fund loads of investment in key areas for climate action that you can see here. This would be good for humanity, but bad for fossil fuel companies. Almost $2.6 trillion of funding for investment, research and development, and in general, stuff to move us to a kind of clean economy and advanced humane society. But after loads of aggressive lobbying, well, you see what on the right. You see it on the right. This gives you an idea of what predatory delay looks like in the political process. So, recap. We're in a climate emergency. Things are on fire. You're not alone if you care about this, and many folk are bringing buckets of water to help. However, predatory delay, fossil fuels. Others are bringing buckets of petrol to this fire. You don't need to be perfect to engage, but you do need to be brave to engage. But there is help to get you through the harder parts. Okay, what can we do as web technologists? What can techies do, really, right? I think there's two ways that I would suggest for a conference when I've got half an hour. The first thing I would do is suggest engaging as members of society. If you're at this conference, you're probably earning above median wages in your country and part of a very professionally mobile group. You can do a lot in terms of offering your money, time, and skills, and probably in that order. Secondly, I think it's worth embedding these principles around climate action into our work as well. I say this as I think we can point to examples of where we have seen similar ideas work on the web before. So, engage as members of society. You can show up for the folks who are already doing the work right now. There's a whole movement, and there has been for decades. And there are lots of people putting in the work because they're scared and they need your help. Fridays for Future is a really good example. It's a global movement of school children who every Friday protest for grown-ups like us to work and act on the climate crisis. They do this because most of them are too young to vote, and they don't have the power to get things changed by themselves. Greta and the kids like Greta and the folks you see here turning up each week have done loads to change perception. But that's not all they've been doing. They've been able to change perception around climate enough to start influencing the public discourse. That's one thing. But it's important to understand they've also been using the law to buttress these changes in public discourse to basically get laws changed as well. This is Lisa, I think it's Neubauer, I never pronounce it correctly. She's like the German version of Greta you can think of. Now her and a group of her children early this year essentially argued this year that the government had a duty of care to children as citizens of the country. They argued that government inaction was infringing their human rights, and they won a massive massive court case this year as a result. This had a massive impact. They got the law changed to compel the government to act with more urgency on climate. They got national targets for the 4th largest economy on Earth, brought forward 5 years, just by a bunch of kids getting together and actually getting these laws changed. There was obviously help from other people and skilled people like you and I, but like this is pretty cool. And you don't just see this in Germany now. Like, I love this photo because it's kind of cute and dorky. This is Milieu Defense. This is like the equivalent to Friends of the Earth in the Netherlands. This is what it looks like when a bunch of normal people win a landmark lawsuit against a multinational oil company. They used a similar argument that the kids in Germany used, that Shell Oil, through their actions, are violating human rights for future generations and people in the Netherlands. So this is violating their rights to have families and live in the future. And in May this year, the Supreme Court in the Netherlands essentially said, yes, that's correct. It's unjust for a company to be allowed to do that. The Supreme Court pretty much pointed to the science and then said pseudo-cut emissions to a huge multinational trillion-dollar company. And they ordered the company to change their entire corporate strategy over the next 10 years. Now, we didn't know we could even do this before, and it sets a huge, really kind of hopeful precedent in my book. We're starting to see wins like this, but it's this late in the day. Winning too slowly is the same as losing. So it's one thing to support people who are already running up and protesting and campaigning and working the way they are. But one other thing you can do is embed the values of like respecting and protecting life in our work itself. And I say this because I think there are precedents with the web that we could look to. So I think we've just seen a talk about accessibility, and you can acknowledge there's still a very, very long way to go. But I'd argue that the fact that we're even talking about accessibility as much as we do now is a positive sign. We have concepts like inclusive design that we didn't have before, and increasingly, we talk about websites that are inaccessible as sites that are not good sites, or sites that are even broken. And I think ideas like poor have helped. So perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. Could I have a show of hands if anyone has seen this before or heard of these terms? Okay, there's a small number of people. Okay, for a site to be accessible, it's generally explained as it has to be perceivable, as in, can I use this site without only being able to perceive the content with my eyes? That makes it available to people who are partially sighted or have any other kinds of disabilities, right? Operable, can I use a site without only being able to use a mouse or a touchscreen? Understandable, can I make sense of the language on this website without being an industry insider or understanding how the organization that I'm trying to interface with is structured? Or robust, can I make use of this site in less than ideal conditions? So the massive React website on a slow connection, that's an example of robustness. And these form the Web Content Authoring Guidelines, or the WCAG, sometimes called like maybe the WCAG, I suppose. Their existence makes it easier for people who write laws to make this a minimum standard people need to meet for a site to be considered working. Now, this is the Government UK, Government Digital Service guidance for all their websites and all the people who build things. Having laws makes it, and having things like poor makes it easier to argue for keeping the web open to the greatest number of people like this. Now, this is the actual guidance that they have specifically for their own developers. So if you're a developer, you're expected to know this kind of stuff. And if you're not doing this, then legally you could be breaking the law. And I don't think it's great for your career if you build websites that essentially break the law all day long, all right? And I think this is actually useful. You can see them talking about poor here. And you can also see this spilling over into the private sector as well. So this is an example of Domino's being on the wrong side of this, when people started arguing for essentially making similar kinds of arguments about human rights and being able to access kind of content, right? It's a long way to go, but there are levers available to us that weren't there before. And I think having accessibility guidelines makes it easier to argue that large companies make accessible products when spending money. Like Amazon is a really good example. Amazon, for them to win a $30 million contract with the New York Public Library a few years ago, they had to agree to make the Kindle more accessible, and measurably more so, as an explicit condition of winning. Now, this is one thing that has helped everyone in the same way that building accessible sites can make things available to a wider chunk of humanity. And I see ideas like POR as fundamentally about respecting people and avoiding harm through thoughtless design decisions. And I think this framing can work for embedding similar sensibilities around climate and how we work. Now, I'm saying this, I'm inspired by POR and the WCAG, and I want to share a model because I'm hoping some of you might come forward at the Mighty Mingle or over the next, say, two days to help me kind of think this through over the next 12 months to kind of come up with some model similar to this. I think we basically need gold. And I present it like this: green, open, lean, and distributed. And let's talk about these in a bit more detail. So green is green energy and greener material inputs. That's for running computers and for making computers. Every time we use the internet right now, for example, even if we don't mean to, we're burning fossil fuels. And that's because the internet is the biggest machine in the world, and it still largely runs on coal. Now, we really need to stop this. It's 2021, and we don't need to build the web with fossil fuels any more than we need to build houses with toxic materials like asbestos these days. And I think that as professionals, we should be using this kind of framing as responsible professionals as well. And there's one thing I'll share with you just as an aside here. When we use websites that use green energy, it doesn't mean that a website is always running 24/7 on renewable power, because I know this just in, solar panels don't work at night, right? There is things like that, yeah? Now, what it usually means these days is that at least as much power has gone into the grid, has been pulled out from the grid to run that infrastructure. Now, this isn't necessarily like the most correct way of doing it, but that's what we've kind of accepted. And some companies are working more for this, but that's the kind of benchmark. And I think that if you're working as a developer, checking if websites use green energy is a pretty useful one, pretty sound first step. And like doing this over time essentially makes the grid greener for every single person. Just like making things accessible for one group makes it accessible for more people. Now, the NGO I work with, the Green Web Foundation, we create free data sets of which websites run on green energy and which ones do not. And we also expose this information over an API so you can build with this. And an example of this is a website called Website Carbon. They basically check if basically how your website has been built, a bit like using, say, Lighthouse and stuff like that. And they compare it to how good it is to other sites, and they give you an idea of the rough carbon footprint of using that website. And you can see if they're running on green energy or bog standard energy, really. So that's green. Let's talk about open. Now, I talk about open in terms of open data, open source, and transparency, not necessarily just open source by itself. If you want to figure out what the greenest country is to run, say, a bunch of servers, you can look at a website called Electricity Map. It's an open source project, and they show in real time how green each electricity grid is around the world. And they make this information available over an API. Now you can see here, for example, that France, it's got loads of nukes, so it's very, very low carbon, regardless of how you feel about nukes, right? Poland, loads and loads of coal, not so green. Now, Germany is the land of coal and solar, so it's kind of in the middle. And you can see, further up north, you can see all these kind of green countries in Northern Europe where you've got loads and loads of hydro. I find it kind of fascinating. Google uses this now. They use this to work out where to dispatch all their massive machine learning jobs for the lowest carbon footprint for this, because these tend to change over time with the weather. Open also allows for new ways to think about digital infrastructure too. So what you're looking at here is the heat exchanging part of a new data center in the Netherlands that's built using Open Compute Service. The Open Compute project is an initiative by a number of big companies like Facebook and Microsoft to build open source server components for a more efficient industry. But because they're open, there are some cool ideas by startups that are also in this field now. So block heating is one example in the Netherlands. Rather than just having massive out-of-town data centers where all the excess heat from running thousands of computers is wasted, or we spend even more energy trying to cool these computers so they don't glow red and explode, they do something different. Instead, they take all these servers, these end-of-life recycled servers from the same big tech companies, They put them in shipping containers. They then connect these shipping containers to greenhouses that grow crops like, say, tomatoes and cucumbers. And to get greenhouses hot enough for tomatoes to grow well, you need to heat them up. And people normally heat them using gas and fossil fuels. So this lets them use the heat from the computers instead to provide that heat rather than having to burn fossil fuels for the same output. Now, I think this is really, really cool. It uses waste heat from servers productively, turning what was a problem into something valuable for someone else. And also, using recycled servers in this way extends the useful life and saves them from landfill. Again, also pretty cool. Then let's talk about lean. So lean is a recognition that right now, all energy that we use has a cost in terms of climate pollution. So efficiency is important. It also means that as a developer, every single step you can take to make a website more efficient, you can probably make a loose moral argument that you're doing good by doing that. And this is actually something, even if you aren't doing that, this is something that we've had some success with as an industry over the last 10 years. So for the last 10 years, if we look at the energy usage for what we might refer to as the engines of the tech sector, so these are the millions of servers and data centers globally, you'll see that it's roughly stayed the same despite a massive explosion in the use that we do actually have. We don't see it here, but it's on the next slide. Sorry, everyone. So this is largely because we've moved away from a large number of traditional data centers, which are not that efficient, towards smaller numbers of much more efficient hyperscale style data centers, like the ones you might associate with Google Cloud, Amazon, Microsoft, and things like that. So just by moving to the cloud, you're probably doing some good. However, unlike these days, you can make the claim that the carbon footprint of the tech sector roughly comparable to the entire shipping sector, like all the cargo ships on Earth, or if you prefer, countries like Germany or Canada. So it's not tiny, but it's not as big as some other sectors. True, centralizing the web like this has its own issues, obviously, but from a climate point of view, having less climate pollution per unit of compute is largely a win. However, as we mentioned, it's not just running computers that causes carbon emissions. Making computers also involves turning sand into computer chips, which is a very, very energy-intensive process. And we should be aware that these embodied emissions also are things we need to take into account. So this chart here shows that because servers are running 24/7, the running costs make a large part of their footprint. So you'd probably want to optimize for the energy over the life, or over their useful life. But for user devices, it's the other way around. Because making every new computer is so energy intensive, we care more about needing to make fewer computers and making them live longer as a way to avoid climate pollution. So this is why I'm quite excited about a new wave of laptops that have been designed from the outset to be repairable, like the Framework laptop here. I think it's a flip from what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, where it's become harder and harder to kind of maintain or look after laptops, such to the point that some companies will basically shred laptops rather than let you repair them if you're going to repair them with anyone else. Now, this is essentially like the Fairphone of laptops now. So there's an open design, and there's an emphasis on user repair. And like you can basically swap in different kind of modules to basically swap out, say, a USB thing for a USB-C, or all kinds of things like that. Now, I think this is interesting because making laptops last a little bit longer like this reduces the carbon footprint over its lifetime. Like with Fairphone, they saw about an increase of around 25% by making people use a phone for 2 more years. So like there are meaningful changes you can have here. Now finally, I'm going to talk about distributed. So moving work, computing work, through time and space to avoid carbon emissions. And this sounds really, really kind of sci-fi and whizzy, but if I show some examples, hopefully it should be a bit clearer. Okay, if you're in the UK, has anyone ever heard of the baking forecast here? Or does anyone bake here, I should say? All right, okay. So I think this is a really cool project. It's a project in the UK that looks at how energy on the grid is being generated. And because baking uses lots of power to run an electric oven, it shows you how to bake greener. Now, for example, it shows you when there's a green time to bake by looking at, say, when there's loads of wind and solar on the grid, right? When that's happening, yeah, go for it. Knock yourself out. Bake something. When there's lots of fossil fuels on the grid, it says, nah, give it a little time. Maybe bake on Tuesday instead of Monday. You can get a forecast to plan for the greenest possible delicious baked goods, right? Now, this is kind of a cool idea. And I am one of the editors of a magazine called Branch, where we took this idea and applied it to the web. So when we know the grid is powering the servers that we run, and when we think it's going to be a green time to serve websites, we will send the full-fat, rich web experience right down the pipe to our users, like you can see here, all right? However, when we know there's lots of fossil fuels on the grid, we know that doing so will result in higher carbon emissions. So what we do instead is we have a page weight budget, which is quite common, but we also have a carbon budget. And we adapt the design to fall back to a lighter weight images-free version. So you can still access the same content, like you can click to see the images and everything like that, but we won't default to showing this. We set a default by doing this. This forces us to think about alt text from the get-go, which is good for accessibility, and as we've seen, making it available to like a wider set of all the other people who aren't on iPhones around the world, for example. But I think it's kind of cool. And the next issue, we want to experiment with web workers to pull down content when we know the energy is green anyway, so that you have this stuff locally. So we can apply lots of the ideas about local first development to build kind of websites like this. So like green baking applied to the web, I suppose. So that's moving things through time. And we saw earlier with electricity map how you can move server workloads to where they're greener. That's moving things through space. But you can also move work through time and space at the same time with some really, really cool new open source next generation networking tools. So there's one called Cyan, and I'm not going to try to explain the acronym, but what I will tell you, it's Swiss and it's very, very cool. Let's have a scenario here. Imagine we're in London and we're connecting to a website in Poland. Now we have to hop across all the grids to get there. And every hop has a carbon footprint determined by how clean the grid is. So France is full of nukes, so it's relatively green, low carbon electricity. Poland has lots of coal, so it's not so green. Germany and England are about middle, depending on the time of day, all right? So that's one scenario, that's like our baseline. Now, one thing we could do is use a CDN to serve traffic from where it's closer and ideally greener. So let's imagine we have a CDN node in France. Instead of just relying on our server in Poland to do all the work. This lets us serve more traffic from a green grid as opposed to a dirty one. Now, we might not be able to serve every single asset from France, for example, but we can at least serve most of it. And that means that we only have to rely on the kind of dirtier routes for a smaller chunk of the traffic. But if we build an awareness of how green the grid is into the internet itself, then it's possible to make routing decisions based on this information. Now, let's assume that in the north of Europe, it's particularly windy that day. We can design for this stuff, and we can make the internet respond and route accordingly. So something like a kind of low-carbon trick shot. So network kind of goes from, say, London to, say, to Germany, and then through Northern Europe, like I think Denmark and Sweden and so on, right? This is not sci-fi. This is stuff that's being worked on with production networks. This is open source, and I think this is the kind of direction we could have with an internet as available and responsive to, well, it's like responsive design, I suppose. This is the kind of stuff that's currently being worked on right now, and I think it's super exciting. So this is the idea: gold, green, open, lean, distributed. I'd really like to kind of nerd out with some of you about this, because I think it's really fascinating. I think there's loads we can do as developers and designers and engineers in this field. So, okay, that's what we covered. We're in a climate emergency. What we can do as web technologists, and gold, a way to think about greening tech. I know this is really, really fast, and I'm sorry. There is a transcript of everything I said with boatloads of references on the website if you follow this link. And yeah, that's me. 25 seconds left. Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was great. That was very informative. By the way, last time Asim Hussain was here, and he founded with some other people the Green Software Foundation.
Yes, we are kind of the co-founders of we are also one of the founding groups setting that up. There is now an open source metric called software carbon intensity, which is being developed in the open. So if you think any of these ideas are cool, you can see people developing standards to implement yourself. If you are a cloud provider, or if you want to measure cloud providers and do this stuff here, there's like loads of stuff out there, and I really like Asim. He's one of the other organizers of climateaction.tech, so it's nice to know that, yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, we have a couple of questions, and there will be lunch after, so I hope you still have the stomach to sit here. So the first question comes from Anonymous again. If there would be one single thing that you would recommend each of us here to do to support the environment, what would it be?
Show up for the kids. Yeah, show up for the kids who are protesting every week. Like, that's the most useful thing I think you can actually do. There's people doing this stuff work, and when you go there, you'll realize there's loads of other people who are like you who care. So I would do that, the absolute first thing.
Very good answer. If I may add my non-expert opinion to it, I feel like when you consume things, you could think about maybe you want to pay a bit extra for like, like conflict-free, diamonds or stuff. Like just there's a reason why some consumer goods are so cheap, and sometimes it just pays to pay a little bit more and then like do something that's like a bit better. All right. So next question, anonymous again. Lots of questions today. What is your take on cryptocurrencies? / blockchain, I'd say. Is there ever a chance to get them environmentally friendly?
Oh God, do I need to answer this question? Like, I think. Okay, the short answer is there are so many other things you could be using this energy for, and I'll just keep it like that because this is such a boring question to answer every single time. It's like just sell your Bitcoin and use it for something more important, right? If you've got some, like we just have an amnesty, then we'll be fine. We won't think you're a dick. It's fine. Like. I'll just leave it like that because I find it really, really hard to talk about this.
Right. Just use Pfizer money. It works. All right. We have 2 more questions. One comes from Peter. A gold browser extension would be interesting. Ooh, yeah, it would be. Is there something planned like that?
There's actually, I spoke about a magazine called Branch. We interviewed a master's student who is a design student. Her name was Lucia Lier, and she built precisely something like this. So that kind of green bakery thing, she did it for Netflix. So it will tell you when to watch Netflix at a kind of green time. So there are examples of that. There's also a browser extension that we've built that does have that, and the libraries that we used, they're also open source, so there is nothing stopping you do that. We've also got an extension that we would love some help with. So if you do fancy doing something like that and you know your way around, say, Chrome extensions or Firefox ones, please do talk to me. I would love your help setting up a really nice CI pipeline so we can get this stuff published on a regular.
Oh, that's great. And then, like that next Netflix thing, really, like together with Sarah's talk earlier, you can now optimize your scrolling time to like the most environment friendly. All right, last question coming from Noah. How could we start trying to get access to data about carbon emissions in the local grid? I'm not sure if I...
Yeah, there are 2 things you can do. This data is often available through... Okay, the European Commission in Europe does this anyway. In the UK, they already have some of these numbers available. In America, now is a good time to be pushing for and asking for this kind of information. If you want these numbers from a cloud provider, there is an open letter for AWS, who have been the slowest to respond for this. Google actually share this information now quite freely, or they're a lot more freely than others. And I think Microsoft are actually moving in this direction too. But that's the thing I would probably suggest. Look at Electricity Map and look at what time. Electricity Map is co-founded by a Swiss guy who I met when I got off the coach, actually. So, yeah, local flavor.
So perfect that you took the coach. That's how you actually make the real change. All right. Okay, we're at the end of the Q&A session here. So lunch is starting down on the ground floor. It should be distributed as well. So, yeah, guten Appetit.
Cool. Thank you.